Domitian, the last ruler of the Flavian dynasty, was one of the most controversial emperors in Roman history, remembered both for his administrative efficiency and his descent into autocracy and fear. Born on October 24th, 51 AD, as Titus Flavius Domitianus, he was the younger son of Vespasian and younger brother of Titus, two emperors who left their mark on Rome's history. Unlike his father and brother, who had established their reputations through military campaigns and public service, Domitian grew up in a different environment, one defined by the shadow of greater men and the turbulence of Rome's political life. His early years were not marked by the same military or political achievements as those of his family. While Vespasian and Titus were forging their legacies in the conquest of Britain and the Jewish wars, Domitian was often overlooked, even underestimated. This shaped much of his personality and fueled the deep insecurities that would define his later reign. During his youth, Domitian was educated in the traditional Roman manner, learning rhetoric, literature, and philosophy. Yet he had a particular inclination toward solitude and study rather than the battlefield. While his brother Titus gained recognition for his military victories, especially in Jerusalem, Domitian remained on the sidelines of Roman politics. He was not entrusted with great responsibilities by his father, partly because Vespasian had never anticipated Domitian to become emperor. Domitian's character developed in a way that blended intelligence with bareness, a combination that would later manifest itself in both reform and cruelty. When his father Vespasian ascended the throne in 69 AD after the tumultuous year of the four emperors, Domitian was suddenly thrust into a position of prominence. Although his elder brother Titus was clearly the heir and already held military glory, Domitian was given minor offices and ceremonial roles within the imperial household. For the first time, he was exposed to the machinery of imperial rule. He participated in senatorial debates and took part in the daily rituals of power, but never enjoyed the trust or responsibility given to Titus. Ancient sources suggest that Domitian felt resentful, sensing that his talents were overlooked while his brother received all the accolades. As seeds of jealousy were planted during this time, and they would later grow into an intense rivalry with the memory of Titus after he ascended the throne. When Vespasian died in 79, a transition of power was smooth. Titus, already loved by the people for his charisma and generosity, became emperor without significant opposition. Domitian, however, was left in the shadows once again. Titus did grant him honors and formal positions, but Domitian desired more authority. This frustrated him, and ancient authors describe how he often clashed with his brother behind the scenes. There were even rumors that Domitian plotted to take power before Titus's natural death, though historians debate whether these accusations were fueled by propaganda after Domitian's own assassination. Regardless of the truth, Domitian's reputation as a jealous and ambitious prince was firmly established. Titus's reign was short, lasting just over 2 years, and when he died suddenly in 81, some said from a fever, others whispering poisoned Domitian, became emperor at the age of 30. His accession was quick and decisive. Unlike previous successions, which were marked by hesitation or disputes, Domitian seized the purple with determination. He was proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard and accepted by the Senate, though the senators did so reluctantly, knowing that Domitian was not as amiable as his brother. From the very beginning of his rule, he set himself apart as a different kind of emperor. Whereas Titus and Vespasian had sought to balance imperial power with senatorial cooperation, Domitian showed little patience for the Senate and preferred to govern directly, relying heavily on the imperial bureaucracy and loyal officers. In the early years of his reign, Domitian worked diligently to strengthen the empire. He increased soldiers' pay, a move that secured the loyalty of the legions and the Praetorian Guard. He paid close attention to the finances of the state, introducing stricter taxation and reforms to prevent corruption in the provinces. His love for administration was evident in the way he involved himself in the details of governance, something few emperors had done so thoroughly since Augustus. Domitian believed in efficiency and order, and he demanded accountability from his officials. Those who were found guilty of corruption faced severe punishments, sometimes even execution. For the people of Rome, his early policies brought stability, but for the senatorial class, they fostered resentment, as they saw their privileges curtailed and their autonomy eroded. Domitian also sought to portray himself as a traditional Roman ruler, deeply connected to the values of religion and morality. He took the title of Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, which shocked many senators who considered it arrogance, but reflected his desire to be seen as a divine ruler. He revived old religious practices and sought to restore what he saw as the moral decline of Roman society. Domitian promoted the worship of traditional Roman gods and expanded the imperial cult, ensuring that loyalty to him was not only political, but also spiritual. He placed great emphasis on Jupiter, the chief deity, and aligned his rule with divine authority. At the same time, he cracked down on what he considered immoral behavior, enforcing laws against adultery and encouraging strict social discipline. This moralizing stance won him admiration from some, but created a sense of fear among those who resented interference in private lives. Militarily, Domitian was active in defending the empire's borders. He campaigned against the Chatti, a Germanic tribe, and celebrated a triumph in Rome for his victories. He strengthened the frontier defenses along the Rhine and Danube, building fortifications that helped secure the empire for generations. Yet his military policies were often criticized. Unlike Titus, Domitian was not a general by nature, and his campaigns were sometimes seen as more symbolic than effective. Still, his emphasis on strengthening the borders reflected his awareness of the growing threats beyond Rome. As his reign continued, Domitian's relationship with the Senate deteriorated further. He distrusted the senatorial class, believing they were disloyal and plotting against him. In response, he centralized power more and more, reducing the Senate to a ceremonial body while real authority rested with him and his loyal administrators. This tension gave rise to an atmosphere of fear and suspicion in Rome. Trials for treason became more frequent, and senators who were accused often faced execution or exile. Domitian believed he was safeguarding Rome, but in doing so, he alienated the elite and cemented his reputation as a tyrant. Despite this hostility from the Senate, Domitian was popular among the common people and the army. He provided games, festivals, and generous distributions of grain. The Colosseum, completed under his father and brother, continued to host spectacles, and Domitian added his own touch by organizing elaborate shows. He also rebuilt parts of Rome damaged by fires and invested in new construction, leaving a mark on the city's architecture. To the ordinary citizen, Domitian appeared as a capable ruler who cared for their welfare. The paradox of Domitian's reign lies in this contrast. He was admired by the people and soldiers, but despised by the senators and historians who recorded his rule. Much of what we know about him comes from writers like Suetonius and Tacitus, who belonged to the senatorial class and had reason to view him negatively. They painted a picture of a cruel and paranoid ruler, prone to sudden executions and harsh punishments. Yet archaeological and administrative evidence suggests that his reign brought stability and effective governance to the empire. By the middle years of his rule, Domitian had consolidated power completely. He ruled as an autocrat, making decisions without consultation and demanding absolute obedience. He styled himself as a new Augustus, not just restoring order, but also redefining what it meant to be emperor. He was deeply insecure, often suspecting conspiracies, and his paranoia grew with time. The Senate's hostility, coupled with genuine plots against his life, fed this mindset. Domitian became increasingly isolated, surrounding himself with loyal guards and withdrawing from public life. His personality, shaped by years of neglect and resentment during his youth, now expressed itself in suspicion and cruelty. And yet, Beneath this image of tyranny, Domitian was also a ruler who paid attention to detail, who sought to reform the empire, and who left behind a stronger state. His policies toward the provinces, his financial reforms, and his emphasis on discipline were undeniably effective. But his inability to reconcile with the senatorial class and his harsh methods of control overshadowed these accomplishments. By the end of the first decade of his reign, he stood as a paradox, loved by many, hated by few but powerful elites, and remembered by history largely through the lens of his enemies. Domitian's reign entered a more complex and controversial stage as it moved into its middle years, marked by increasing centralization of power, strained relations with the Senate, significant military campaigns, and a tightening grip on Roman society that revealed both his strengths as an administrator and his weaknesses as an autocrat. By the time he had secured his position, after the initial uncertainties following his brother Titus's death, Domitian was intent on establishing himself as a permanent and unchallenged master of Rome, embodying the ideals of a monarch in a system that still claimed to be a republic in form, though long transformed by the power of emperors. Unlike his father Vespasian and brother Titus, who often portrayed themselves as first among equals, Domitian began to emphasize his supremacy more openly. He frequently used titles such as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, which shocked many traditionalists in the Senate, who saw this as an abandonment of the Augustan balance between imperial authority and republican traditions. This insistence on divine status was both a reflection of his personality and a political tool to secure loyalty, for it demanded recognition of his absolute authority from subjects across the empire. During this period, Domitian embarked on a series of building projects that left a lasting mark on Rome. He was an enthusiastic builder, and his works transformed the city. Among his most notable contributions was the completion of the Flavian Palace on the Palatine Hill, a magnificent complex that served as both his private residence and an official space for imperial ceremonies. Designed by the architect Rabirius, the palace became a symbol of imperial grandeur, showcasing Domitian's ambition to outshine his predecessors. He also restored the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, which had burned down during Titus's reign, ensuring that Rome's most sacred temple was rebuilt with splendor. Furthermore, he commissioned the Stadium of Domitian, a venue for athletic competitions modeled after Greek designs, which later became the basis for Rome's Piazza Navona. These projects not only provided employment and showcased imperial generosity, but also reinforced Domitian's image as the restorer and benefactor of the city, linking his legacy to Rome's prosperity and cultural life. Yet while his building programs gained admiration, Domitian's political methods grew increasingly harsh. His relationship with the Senate was fraught with tension. Unlike Vespasian and Titus, who maintained relatively cordial ties with the senatorial class, Domitian distrusted the senators and often excluded them from significant positions of influence. He preferred to rely on the equestrian order, the class just below the senators, whom he considered more loyal and less corrupt. This alienation of the Senate deepened hostility toward him among Rome's aristocracy, though he sought to compensate by winning the support of the army and the people. Domitian was keenly aware that emperors who lost the army's loyalty could not survive, so he lavished attention on the legions, increasing their pay and personally inspecting the troops. His emphasis on discipline, efficiency, and loyalty earned him respect among the military ranks, ensuring a solid base of support that would serve him throughout his reign. Military campaigns defined much of Domitian's mid-reign. He launched efforts to secure Rome's frontiers and to expand its influence. One of his first major campaigns was in Germany, where he led expeditions against the Chatti, a powerful Germanic tribe that posed a threat to Roman territory. Domitian personally took part in the campaign, which resulted in the establishment of new military bases and fortifications along the Rhine. Although ancient sources sometimes downplayed these victories, portraying them as exaggerated or even staged for propaganda. Archaeological evidence suggests that Domitian's efforts significantly strengthened Rome's northern defenses. He also launched campaigns in the Balkans and along the Danube, where the Dacians under King Decebalus were becoming an increasingly dangerous power. Domitian's wars against the Dacians were mixed in results. Initial defeats embarrassed him, but subsequent peace treaties allowed him to claim success. While critics mocked the treaty for granting subsidies to Decebalus, the arrangement bought Rome time and stability on its frontier. Domitian's governance extended beyond military campaigns and building works. He was a strict and hands-on ruler, often personally overseeing the administration of justice. He prided himself on fairness in dealing with ordinary citizens, often attending court cases and punishing corrupt officials. This direct involvement in governance won him popularity among the lower classes, who saw him as a protector against abuses by the wealthy elite. At the same time, however, his severity and suspicion toward potential rivals created an atmosphere of fear. He employed a network of informers and encouraged accusations of treason, which led to a number of executions of senators and other figures who were perceived as threats. For Domitian, this was a matter of survival. He remembered the fates of emperors like Caligula and Nero, who had been overthrown by conspiracies, and he resolved not to fall victim to similar plots. However, this policy of repression deepened the hatred of the aristocracy and colored his historical reputation, as most surviving accounts of his reign were written by senators hostile to his memory. Religion also played a significant role during Domitian's reign, and he saw himself as a guardian of traditional Roman morality and piety. He revived laws against immorality, cracking down on adultery and luxurious excess. He took a personal interest in the priesthoods and religious offices, ensuring that Rome's religious traditions were upheld. At the same time, his insistence on being addressed as Dominus et Deus blurred the line between emperor and divinity, creating unease among those who still clung to republican ideals. Domitian's religious policies also intersected with his treatment of minority groups. He is remembered for persecuting certain philosophical schools, particularly the Stoics, whom he saw as dangerous critics of tyranny. Some sources also suggest he imposed harsh measures on Jews and Christians, including the imposition of the Fiscus Judaicus, a tax levied on Jews throughout the empire. While the full extent of Christian persecution under Domitian remains debated, his reign undoubtedly brought challenges for religious minorities who resisted conformity. Culturally, Domitian's reign was paradoxical. On one hand, he was a patron of the arts, supporting poets like Martial, Statius, and Quintilian, whose works flourished under his rule. These writers often praised the emperor, either sincerely or out of necessity, and their works provide valuable insights into Domitian's cultural impact. On the other hand, his censorship and authoritarian control stifled dissent, and many writers who opposed him remained silent or critical in private. The result was a cultural climate marked by both celebration and fear, where public praise coexisted with private resentment. The later years of Domitian's reign saw his autocratic tendencies intensify further. By now, he was deeply suspicious of conspiracies, and his reliance on informers created a climate of paranoia in Rome. Executions and exiles increased, targeting not only genuine threats, but also many who may have been innocent. Domitian's refusal to share power, his distrust of the Senate, and his insistence on divine honors all combined to isolate him from the traditional elites of Roman society. Yet despite these tensions, the empire remained stable and prosperous under his rule. The frontiers were secure, the economy was managed with care, and the common people enjoyed games, spectacles, and a sense of order. For the average Roman citizen or soldier, Domitian's reign may have seemed strong and beneficial, even if the senatorial class saw it as oppressive. As Part 2 closes, Domitian stands at the height of his power. He has secured the loyalty of the army, expanded Rome's frontiers, and reshaped the city with his building programs. Yet beneath the surface of strength lies a growing tension between emperor and senate, between absolute authority and lingering republican ideals, between public admiration and private resentment. These contradictions would shape the final years of his reign, as Domitian's increasing isolation and suspicion pushed him toward a tragic end that mirrored the dangers faced by emperors before him. Domitian's reign by its middle years had become one of paradoxes, contradictions, and sharply drawn contrasts between prosperity and repression, between architectural splendor and political terror, between administrative competence and personal paranoia. He was an emperor who genuinely believed in the dignity and authority of his position, elevating the imperial office to a level of sanctity that few before him had dared to claim. Yet at the same time, he was increasingly isolated by his own suspicion of the Senate and the aristocracy. His policies in the provinces and his reforms at home demonstrated efficiency, foresight, and attention to detail, but his treatment of Rome's political class bred a climate of fear. To understand the later part of Domitian's reign, one must explore not just the practical measures he implemented, but also the growing perception of him as a tyrant, which would ultimately overshadow his achievements. One of the most striking features of Domitian's administration was his insistence on centralization of power. He positioned himself as the supreme source of authority in nearly all aspects of Roman governance, bypassing traditional senatorial influence wherever possible. Domitian greatly expanded the role of the equestrian order in administration, appointing equestrians rather than senators to positions of real responsibility, particularly in the provinces and the financial bureaucracy. This undermined the senatorial elite, who had for centuries seen themselves as the natural governing class of Rome. To equestrians, however, this shift meant greater opportunities for advancement, loyalty to the emperor, and efficiency in carrying out his directives. Domitian recognized that senators often resented emperors, while equestrians were more dependent on imperial favor for their careers, making them safer administrators in his eyes. At the same time, Domitian took great care to enforce strict standards of honesty and accountability in provincial government. Corruption had long plagued Rome's empire, with governors exploiting their territories for personal enrichment at the expense of local populations. Domitian instituted harsher penalties for extortion and introduced measures to monitor governors more closely. In this way, he secured a reputation among provincials as a just ruler, even when the Senate back in Rome decried him as despotic. For many outside the capital, Domitian's reign was marked by stability, reduced corruption, and the construction of public works that improved daily life. Archaeological evidence from provinces such as Africa, Gaul, and the Eastern territories shows investment in infrastructure that continued to support Roman prosperity long after his death. Domitian also took pride in his building projects in Rome itself. He understood that architecture was both propaganda and a statement of imperial power. Among his most notable constructions was the rebuilding of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, which had burned in 80 CE during the reign of Titus. Domitian restored it with unprecedented magnificence, covering its roof with gilded tiles and filling it with art treasures from across the empire. The temple became a symbol of his devotion to Rome's traditional gods, even as Domitian styled himself with quasi-divine honors. He also built the Stadium of Domitian, a large venue for Greek-style athletic contests, which survives today as the shape of Rome's Piazza Navona. His palace on the Palatine Hill, a so-called Flavian palace, was another testimony to his grandeur, dominating the city with its sheer scale and opulence. These works gave Rome a splendor that impressed both citizens and foreigners, leaving behind legacies that endured even after his fall. Despite his role as a builder and restorer, Domitian's increasing adoption of divine imagery alienated many senators. He was the first emperor to demand to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, during his lifetime, a title previously reserved for deified emperors after their deaths. While this assertion of divine status enhanced his aura among the army and the provinces, the Senate found it arrogant and offensive. Traditional Roman values emphasized modesty and the collective role of the Senate in governance. Domitian's self-presentation as a living god undermined that tradition. The result was a widening gulf between emperor and Senate, a gulf that no amount of architectural splendor could bridge. The emperor's growing isolation was matched by his increasing reliance on authoritarian methods. Trials for treason, known as maestas trials, became more frequent during his later reign. Senators and wealthy elites could find themselves accused of conspiracy on little evidence, and executions or forced suicides became more common. These measures created a culture of fear within Rome's upper classes. Informants thrived under Domitian, reporting alleged plots to the emperor, who often believed them. His paranoia may have been fueled by genuine conspiracies, as the memory of plots against earlier emperors like Nero and Galba was still fresh. But the breadth of his suspicion ensured that even loyal senators could fall under suspicion. To the Senate, Domitian became a tyrant who curtailed their dignity and treated them as little more than potential traitors. Yet in stark contrast, Domitian remained popular with the Roman army. He paid the legions well, increased their salaries, and ensured they were provided with new fortifications along Rome's frontiers. His military campaigns, though sometimes criticized as inconclusive, demonstrated his commitment to maintaining the empire's borders. In the north, he fought wars against the Chatti, a Germanic tribe, establishing new forts and roads that secured Roman territory. In Dacia, across the Danube, Domitian waged campaigns against King Decebalus, though with mixed results. Rome suffered defeats, and ultimately Domitian negotiated a peace that included the payment of subsidies to the Dacians, a move that was seen by many Romans as humiliating. Still, the arrangement ensured temporary peace along the Danube and allowed Rome to avoid a drawn-out conflict. To the soldiers who benefited from his attention and pay, Domitian was a respected commander-in-chief, a protector of the empire's frontiers. Another area where Domitian sought to enforce order was Roman morality. He positioned himself as a moral reformer, attempting to restore traditional Roman virtues. He reintroduced strict laws against adultery, prosecuted corruption vigorously, and even forbade the castration of young boys, a practice associated with Eastern luxuries that Romans disdained. Domitian styled himself as a censor perpetuus, a perpetual censor, responsible for upholding the morals of Roman society. To many ordinary Romans, this moral stance appealed to their sense of tradition and discipline. But to the aristocracy, it represented yet another intrusion of the emperor into their private lives. His rigid personal morality stood in contrast with earlier emperors like Nero, who had been notorious for debauchery, but it also gave Domitian a reputation for sternness and inflexibility. Domitian's character was marked by contradictions. On one hand, he was personally frugal, careful with the empire's finances, and concerned with efficiency in governance. On the other, he lavished funds on building projects, games, and displays of imperial grandeur. He was devoted to Rome's traditional gods and promoted their worship, yet he demanded divine honors for himself. He was admired by the army and respected by provincial administrators, but hated by the Senate. These contradictions fueled the polarized legacy he would leave behind. By the later years of his reign, Domitian had retreated further into isolation. Accounts from ancient historians, many of them senatorial, describe him as increasingly suspicious, surrounding himself with astrologers, informers, and secret police. Though such accounts are often colored by bias against him, they suggest a ruler who struggled to trust anyone outside his closest circle. His marriage to Domitia Longina, initially strong, had suffered strains, including allegations of infidelity and political intrigue, though she ultimately remained with him until his death. Domitian's lack of an heir further complicated his position, as the succession remained uncertain, creating more tension among those who might hope to succeed him. The final years of Domitian's reign saw his rule marked by both remarkable achievements and oppressive control. He strengthened the empire's defenses, maintained fiscal stability, and left behind monuments that defined Rome's architectural landscape. Yet his insistence on personal divinity, his persecution of senators, and his paranoid reliance on treason trials earned him enduring hostility from the political elite. In the eyes of those elites, Domitian was a tyrant, a despot who diminished their dignity and ruled through fear. In the eyes of the army and many provincials, however, he was a capable and disciplined emperor who brought stability and order to the Roman world. As the stage was set for the end of his reign, Domitian stood as a paradoxical figure, admired, feared, respected, and hated in equal measure. His rule had secured Rome's frontiers, enriched its treasury, and adorned its capital with monuments, yet it had also alienated the Senate so profoundly that his eventual downfall would be celebrated by many of the aristocrats who had once trembled under his authority. The seeds of his assassination had already been sown, even if Domitian himself, in his suspicion and isolation, did not yet fully grasp how close the danger was. His reign was drawing to a close, but the legacy of his style of autocratic rule would endure, shaping perceptions of emperorship long after his death. Domitian's reign entered its final years with an atmosphere that combined heightened tension, paranoia, and relentless attempts to secure a legacy that matched his vision of Rome's eternal greatness. By the time the emperor had ruled for more than a decade, he had successfully maintained stability, defended the empire's borders, and restored Rome's financial strength. Yet, the very qualities that had made Domitian an effective ruler, his suspicion, his unwillingness to tolerate dissent, and his increasingly authoritarian approach, also created a climate of fear and alienation among the Senate, the aristocracy, and even members of his household. As his reign advanced into the 90s CE, Domitian became both a man obsessed with control and an emperor determined to shape the empire into a reflection of his rigid ideals. Domitian's later reign was characterized by his increasing reliance on surveillance, control, and harsh measures to eliminate any possible opposition. He had long employed a network of spies, informers, and loyal freedmen to gather intelligence about conspiracies, whispers of discontent, or political maneuvering. In earlier years, such methods had helped him uncover real threats, including aristocrats plotting against his life. But over time, the use of informants blurred the line between truth and rumor, and accusations, sometimes false or exaggerated, led to the downfall of many individuals. Senators, equestrians, writers, and even philosophers were exiled, executed, or stripped of their positions because Domitian could not tolerate even the possibility of disloyalty. What made this environment especially chilling was that the emperor increasingly equated criticism of his rule with treason against Rome itself. At the same time, Domitian was deeply invested in maintaining the prosperity and grandeur of the empire. He had already rebuilt significant parts of Rome after fires and natural disasters. He completed the Grand Arch of Titus, dedicated to his brother's victories, and continued developing monumental architecture to celebrate the Flavian dynasty. He expanded the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, transforming it into an awe-inspiring residence meant to symbolize the majesty of the emperor. For Domitian, architecture was not merely about providing practical functions. It was about projecting authority, permanence, and divine favor. He wanted every stone laid in Rome to speak of his power and his family's eternal role in Roman history. These projects not only beautified the city, but also employed countless citizens and workers, reinforcing his role as a provider for the people. Despite his authoritarian policies, Domitian remained attentive to the needs of the Roman populace, particularly the urban poor and the army. He continued the distribution of grain, ensured that games and spectacles were held regularly, and invested in public works that improved the quality of life in the capital. The Colosseum, begun by his father Vespasian and completed under Titus, continued to host lavish gladiatorial games under Domitian. He even staged elaborate naval battles, theatrical performances, and wild animal hunts to keep the people entertained and loyal. His policies toward the army were even more generous. Domitian raised soldiers' pay by 1/3, the first such increase in more than a century, ensuring their loyalty and securing their affection. The military, in turn, remained steadfastly supportive of him even in the darkest days of his rule. Nevertheless, relations with the Senate grew increasingly strained. Domitian's vision of governance was unapologetically autocratic. He saw the Senate as little more than an advisory body and insisted on their unquestioning obedience. Many senators, especially those from noble families, resented his heavy-handedness and constant suspicion. They were forced to flatter him, address him with divine titles, and accept his decisions without debate. To them, Domitian was not a guardian of Roman traditions, but a tyrant who degraded the dignity of the Senate. Over the years, this resentment simmered into open hostility. Even when Domitian appointed senators to prestigious positions, they often viewed these appointments as traps, fearful that any misstep could bring accusations of disloyalty and death. The relationship between emperor and senate was poisoned by mutual distrust, and this rift would play a decisive role in Domitian's downfall. Domitian's private life during these later years was also marked by tension. His marriage to Domitia Longina had endured despite difficulties. At one point, Domitian dismissed her for alleged infidelity, but he later recalled her to the palace, and she remained with him until the end. Ancient sources suggest that Domitian could be jealous and possessive, traits consistent with his suspicious nature. However, Domitia played an important role in maintaining the image of imperial stability and continuity. Whether out of loyalty, fear, or ambition, she stayed by his side, navigating the dangerous world of palace politics. In foreign affairs, Domitian continued to face challenges that required decisive action. His campaigns in Germania were among his most notable military undertakings. After a Roman defeat at the hands of Germanic tribes, Domitian personally led campaigns along the Rhine and Danube, eventually securing a defensive frontier known as the Limes Germanicus. He fortified this region with a series of walls, watchtowers, and forts, establishing a clear boundary between Roman-controlled territory and hostile tribes. While not as glamorous as conquests that added vast new provinces, Domitian's strategy of fortification was practical and forward-looking. It recognized the limits of Roman expansion and prioritized defense, stability, and the prevention of costly wars. Historians today often see this as one of his most important contributions to the long-term security of the empire. His dealings with Dacia, however, were more complex. The Dacians, led by King Decebalus, posed a persistent threat along the Danube frontier. Domitian fought campaigns against them and forced Decebalus to accept Roman suzerainty, effectively making Dacia a client kingdom. However, the peace was uneasy, as Rome had to provide subsidies and military assistance to Decebalus in exchange for his loyalty. Many in Rome criticized this settlement as humiliating, accusing Domitian of weakness for failing to conquer Dacia outright. Yet the emperor may have recognized that a full-scale war in the Balkans would have been costly and destabilizing, and so he opted for a pragmatic compromise. Ironically, it would later be Domitian's successor, Trajan, who undertook the conquest of Dacia, but only after years of preparation that built upon Domitian's defensive measures. Domitian's cultural policies also reflected his personality. He was a patron of the arts, literature, and architecture, yet his controlling nature extended even here. He maintained strict oversight of public morals and religious practices, reviving traditional rituals and promoting the worship of Roman gods alongside his own cult. He presented himself not just as emperor, but as a semi-divine figure chosen by the gods to guide Rome. Titles such as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, were applied to him, likely at his own encouragement. While many citizens accepted this as part of the grandeur of imperial rule, Others, especially senators and intellectuals, found it intolerable, seeing it as evidence of his vanity and despotism. By the mid-90s CE, Domitian's paranoia reached new heights. He was convinced that conspiracies surrounded him on all sides, and in truth, many senators did despise him enough to plot against him. Executions and exiles became more frequent. Philosophers such as Epictetus and members of noble families were driven from Rome. Some of these actions were responses to genuine conspiracies, but others appear to have been the product of suspicion and fear. Each purge only deepened the hatred of the Senate and aristocracy, isolating Domitian further from the very elites who had once supported his father and brother. The emperor's final years were overshadowed by the sense that his reign had become unsustainable. He was still popular among the army and the common people of Rome, who appreciated his generosity and protection. But in the palaces and senatorial villas, whispers of discontent grew louder. By 96 CE, a conspiracy had indeed taken root within Domitian's inner circle. Members of his court, including freedmen, officers of the guard, and possibly even his wife Domitia, were implicated in the plot. They feared for their lives and futures under Domitian's increasingly suspicious eye, and they resolved to act before he struck against them. The assassination of Domitian came swiftly on September 18, 96 CE. Accounts differ on the exact details, but most sources agree that the plotters ambushed him in his palace. A freedman named Stephanus, feigning an injury with his arm in a sling, concealed a dagger and stabbed the emperor. Others joined in, and Domitian, though fighting back fiercely, was ultimately overwhelmed and killed. He was 44 years old and had ruled for 15 years. With his death, the Flavian dynasty came to an abrupt end, and the Senate quickly moved to condemn his memory. The aftermath of Domitian's assassination was dramatic. The Senate declared damnatio memoria against him, erasing his name from inscriptions, toppling his statues, and attempting to wipe his memory from Roman history. For the senatorial class, it was a symbolic act of liberation from tyranny. They elevated Nerva, a respected elder statesman, as the new emperor, signaling a return to senatorial cooperation with the throne. Yet, among the army and the people, Domitian's death was not universally celebrated. Many soldiers mourned him, remembering his generosity and fairness, and riots reportedly broke out in some places where news of his murder spread. The Senate may have loathed him, but the empire was more divided in its judgment. In the centuries that followed, Domitian's reputation was shaped largely by the writings of hostile senatorial historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Younger. They portrayed him as a cruel, paranoid tyrant whose reign was marked by fear and oppression. Yet modern historians, with the benefit of distance and broader evidence, often take a more balanced view. Domitian was undeniably authoritarian and ruthless in dealing with dissent, but he was also an effective administrator who left the empire financially sound, its borders secure, and its people cared for. His architectural projects and military strategies had lasting impacts, and his rule, while controversial, was not without achievements. In the end, Domitian's legacy is one of contradictions. He was both feared and admired, condemned and respected, remembered as both tyrant and protector. His reign illustrates the perils of absolute power in a system where one man's personality could define the fate of an entire empire. The Flavian dynasty, begun with Vespasian's rise after civil war, ended with Domitian's violent fall, leaving Rome to chart a new course under the emperors of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. For all his attempts to shape Rome in his image, Domitian became a cautionary tale of how suspicion and autocracy could secure an empire for a time, but ultimately sow the seeds of downfall. Domitian's final years were defined by paranoia, suspicion, and cruelty, but also by a strange consistency in governance. Despite his ruthless treatment of senators, philosophers, and aristocrats, the administration of the empire under his rule functioned with relative stability. The provinces continued to be managed with efficiency, Rome's finances remained strong, the army was loyal, and grand construction projects reshaped the physical appearance of the capital. Yet beneath this surface of strength, the emperor's personal fears grew deeper, shaping the very last years of his reign and setting the stage for his bloody downfall. Domitian had lived his entire life in the shadow of others. As the younger son of Vespasian, he had never been considered the natural heir to the throne. His elder brother Titus had carried the dignity of the family name forward, becoming emperor after their father's death, while Domitian had remained a figure on the margins. Even when power was thrust upon him after Titus' early death, the Senate never fully accepted his rule. He knew from the beginning that he was despised by aristocrats who considered him unworthy, uncultured, and illegitimate as a prince. This resentment hardened into hostility as his policies against senatorial authority became harsher. By the last years of his reign, Domitian felt surrounded by enemies everywhere. In the imperial court, whispers and intrigues became daily occurrences. The Senate had become little more than a ceremonial body stripped of influence. Domitian had repeatedly humiliated senators, forced them into acts of public submission, and executed several under accusations of conspiracy. Philosophers who dared to criticize tyranny had been expelled from Rome. Even within the palace, the emperor trusted few. He relied heavily on freedmen and servants rather than noble advisors, further alienating the upper class. By contrast, among the soldiers and the common people, Domitian still maintained popularity. The army respected him as a disciplined commander who ensured they were well paid and well supplied. The people of Rome enjoyed the spectacles he staged, the gifts he distributed, and the magnificent buildings he erected. This divide between the Senate and the rest of society defined his reign. Domitian was loved by many ordinary Romans, but hated by the elites who traditionally decided the fate of emperors. His paranoia grew extreme in the final years. Ancient sources describe how he painted the walls of his palace with a special reflective material so he could see behind him, fearing assassins might strike at any moment. He carried a dagger under his pillow at night and trusted almost no one, not even members of his own family. He became increasingly obsessed with omens and prophecies, interpreting every thunderclap or dream as a message about his fate. Domitian believed in astrology and often consulted astrologers, though ironically, he banned them when predictions turned against him. He executed those who suggested his death was near, attempting to defy fate by eliminating the messengers. This atmosphere of fear poisoned the court, where even the emperor's closest attendants lived under the shadow of suspicion. Despite this oppressive environment, Domitian continued to expand his building program, ensuring that his legacy would be etched into the stones of Rome. His greatest architectural achievement was the completion of the Flavian Palace on the Palatine Hill, a sprawling complex designed to showcase imperial grandeur. He also renovated the Circus Maximus, expanded the Colosseum, built temples, and commissioned monuments celebrating military victories. The appearance of Rome during his rule was transformed into a spectacle of Flavian glory. For Domitian, architecture was not only about utility, but about sending a clear message that his reign was strong, prosperous, and permanent. The irony, of course, was that no amount of marble and stone could protect him from the plots forming in secret chambers. One of the most controversial aspects of Domitian's later reign was his increasing desire to be treated as a living god. He demanded to be addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. While other emperors had accepted divine honors after their deaths, Domitian insisted on worship during his lifetime. This demand alienated the Senate further, as many senators saw it as arrogance and sacrilege. The emperor's insistence on godlike status fueled resentment and ridicule behind closed doors, though few dared express it openly. His religious policies also reflected his authoritarian character. He supported the traditional Roman gods, restored temples, and emphasized morality. But he also pursued harsh measures against groups he considered subversive, including Jews and Christians. These communities, already marginalized in Roman society, suffered under his reign as he imposed heavy taxes and accusations of impiety. For Christians in particular, Domitian's reign became remembered as a time of persecution, with several prominent figures allegedly executed for refusing to worship the emperor or the Roman gods. The turning point that sealed Domitian's fate came with a growing number of conspiracies against his life. His harshness towards senators had created a powerful class of enemies who only needed the right moment to strike. Meanwhile, within his household, cracks began to appear. His wife, Domitia Longina, had long endured his volatile behavior. At one point, Domitian even divorced her after suspecting her of infidelity, only to later reconcile. But their relationship was never stable, and some ancient historians suggest she may have secretly joined the conspirators who plotted his assassination. Court officials, senators, and even members of the Praetorian Guard became involved in these schemes. The exact details of Domitian's assassination are clouded by conflicting accounts, but the general outline is clear. On September 18, 96 CE, Domitian was murdered in his palace. According to ancient sources, his chamberlain Parthenius played a key role in the plot, along with a freedman named Stephanus, who pretended to have an injured arm in order to conceal a dagger beneath his bandages. On the day of the assassination, Stephanus approached the emperor under the pretense of delivering important documents. When Domitian bent over to read them, Stephanus struck. A violent struggle followed, with Domitian fighting desperately for his life. Despite being caught by surprise, the emperor was physically strong and wounded his attacker. However, other conspirators rushed in and joined the assault. Domitian was stabbed repeatedly until he fell dead on the floor of his palace bedroom. He was only 44 years old and had ruled for 15 years. The aftermath of Domitian's death revealed the depth of senatorial hatred toward him. The Senate immediately condemned his memory, declaring damnatio memoriae, a formal erasure of his legacy. Statues were destroyed, inscriptions were chiseled away, and his name was removed from monuments. Officially, it was as if Domitian had never existed. The Senate rejoiced at his death, eager to restore their dignity after years of humiliation. Yet among the people and the army, his assassination sparked sorrow. Soldiers grieved the loss of a ruler who had treated them well, and common citizens mourned the emperor who had given them games and gifts. The divide between elite and popular memory of Domitian became one of the most striking features of his legacy. With Domitian gone, the Senate quickly selected Marcus Cocceius Nerva as the new emperor. Nerva was an elderly, childless senator seen as a safe choice, a man unlikely to repeat Domitian's autocratic rule. His appointment marked the beginning of the era, later known as the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, a period remembered for its relative stability and wise emperors. Yet Nerva's rule also revealed the lingering influence of Domitian, for the army still held great loyalty to the fallen emperor and resented the Senate's jubilation at his death. To secure his position, Nerva had to compromise with the military by adopting Trajan, a popular general, as his heir. Thus, the transition after Domitian's assassination was not as smooth as senators had hoped. Looking back, Domitian remains one of the most controversial emperors of Rome. Ancient historians, many of them senators, or writing under senatorial influence, painted him as a cruel tyrant, paranoid despot, and enemy of liberty. Writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny the Younger described his reign in dark colors, emphasizing his suspicion, executions, and arrogance. Yet modern historians have begun to reconsider this image. While acknowledging his cruelty, they also recognize that Domitian was an effective administrator, a builder of lasting monuments, and a ruler who maintained stability in the empire. His financial reforms strengthened the state, his military kept Rome secure, and his projects gave the city grandeur. For ordinary Romans, he was not a monster but a provider. In many ways, Domitian's story reflects the tension between two different visions of Rome. For the Senate and aristocrats, he was a tyrant who trampled their privileges. For the common people and soldiers, he was a strong leader who delivered prosperity and entertainment. This divide explains why his memory was damned officially, yet his achievements could not be erased entirely. Even today, the Flavian Palace, the reconstructed Circus Maximus, and parts of the Colosseum still bear silent witness to his reign. The tragedy of Domitian lies in his inability to balance his authoritarian instincts with the expectations of Rome's elite. Unlike Augustus, who carefully managed senatorial pride, or Vespasian, who blended authority with pragmatism, Domitian ruled with a heavy hand, demanding obedience and crushing opposition. His paranoia only deepened the cycle of repression and conspiracy. Had he trusted more and feared less, perhaps his reign could have lasted longer and ended more peacefully. Instead, his life concluded in betrayal, violence, and dishonor. Yet beneath the propaganda of his enemies, the image of Domitian as a competent if ruthless ruler emerges, one who ensured the empire's stability even as he lost his soul to suspicion. Thus, the story of Domitian closes with a paradox. He was both a destroyer and a builder, both feared and admired, both cursed and remembered. His reign serves as a reminder of the fragility of absolute power, how quickly loyalty can turn to betrayal, how fear can consume even the mightiest, and how history often judges rulers not only by their achievements, but by the enemies they leave behind. Domitian sought immortality through monuments and divine titles, but instead his legacy became a warning that the emperor who rules through fear may control the present, but he cannot command the future.